he's an early Amorah. He's an early commentator on the Mishnah. He says, a blessing must have you, atah. As Psalms teaches, I've set the Lord before me always. Shmuel, who, you have Hillel and Shammai, you often have Rav and Shmuel. There are these pairs of rabbis who often come together in disagreement. So Shmuel says a blessing does not need to include you because it places humans in too intimate a relationship with the creator of the universe. Shmuel here is hearkening to a chapter in Exodus. The people are at Mount Sinai and they experience God's revelation and they're terrified. And they say to Moses, Moses, you be our go-to guy. God can talk to you and you relay the message to us. We're scared out of our wits. We think God's going to zap us if we listen to this anymore. So Moses, you have a nice relationship with God. Geh gesundter Hey. And tell us what we need to hear. So Shmuel is picking up on that, and Shmuel is saying, yeah, there's this danger of becoming too close to God, becoming too intimate. And the word atah, the second person, you, draws us too close. Now, those of us who know the classical form of the blessing can guess who carries the day in this case, and that is Rav. So Rav says an authentic prayer is one that says Baruch Atah Adonai. Now, if you look in the Bible, we looked at all those verses from the Bible, from Ezra, from the servant of Abraham, from Yitro. None of them has Atah. But again, we're coming into a period of formalization of our liturgy. And so when we express a prayer to God, it's got to have a particular form. So while prayer is meant to be spontaneous and from the heart, we see the beginnings here of a formalization of liturgy. There are some other worthwhile texts that you can look at. I want to just flip down to, I think it's the fourth text on the page, Babylonian Talmud, Brachot 35a. This introduces us to the concept of the blessing before partaking of food. All right. So we know that when we eat a piece of bread, before we take that piece of bread, what do we say? Hamotzi. Okay, we praise God, who has. Let's listen to the words. Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, who brings forth, who brings out of the earth bread. Right now, we know God does not literally bring forth loaves of bread out of the ground. Bread actually is a very labor-intensive process, and we are partners with God in that process. We have to grow the wheat. We have to mill the wheat. We have to ferment the wheat with yeast and do all this stuff. We have to knead the dough. Bread is a very labor-intensive process, but before we partake of bread, we say this blessing, acknowledging that God is the ultimate source. So we don't become complacent and think that it just happens, or that we can produce these things. The Babylonian Talmud instructs us to be mindful of God every time we partake of food. I'll read this text. Rav Judah says in the name of Samuel, to enjoy anything of this world without a benediction is like making personal use of things consecrated to heaven, since it says, the earth is the Lord's and its fullness thereof. The idea of something consecrated to heaven is an image that goes back to temple times. If you took a piece of food that was appropriated to the temple, that belonged to the Kohanim, that was a crime, and you had to make atonement for that. If so the rabbis here are saying that if you have a piece of bread, we don't have the temple anymore, but having a piece of food without acknowledging the source of that food is like going back into the temple times and committing that terrible crime of taking from the temple. So here's a perfect example of the rabbis rebuilding Judaism after the temple. We don't have a temple. Judaism could have disappeared after the destruction of the temple. But the rabbis say, no, we will continue. We will hearken back to the temple for some of our imagery, but we will create a Judaism that doesn't need the temple. So all of a sudden, all of us are priests. All of us have access to God. And to say a blessing over bread is acknowledging that that piece of bread ultimately belongs to God. And there's a supporting verse from Psalms, the earth is the Lord's and its fullness thereof. Now there's a dispute here. Rabbi Levi contrasts two texts. It is written, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. But it's also written, this we say this in Hallel, Hashamayim shamayim ladonai, v'haaretz natan livnei adam. The heavens are the heavens of the Lord, but the earth he's given to the children of man, to human beings. So he's presenting a kasha, difficulty. He's saying, you say that the earth is the Lord's and its fullness thereof, but don't we have another text in the Bible which says God is in charge of heaven, people are in charge of the earth. Therefore, when we make our bread, it's our bread. It's our earth, it's our bread. We grew the wheat. We kneaded the dough. What do we need to bless God for? It's ours. Okay? I mean, good question, right? But the Talmud says there's no contradiction. In one case, that is, in one of those verses, it is before a blessing has been said. In the other case, after. So, in other words, the earth is the Lord's and its fullness thereof. That's before we make a blessing. When we say the blessing, that gives us entree. That gives us permission to partake of God's world. It's a formal transition. It's an acknowledgement that the earth is the Lord's, but we have a stake in it. We can partake in it. We're partners with God in creation, but we still have to acknowledge that God is the ultimate source of creation. So we say a blessing to make that bridge, to make that acknowledgement. So we say a blessing over bread. We say that God has brought forth the bread from the earth, even though we, or our human representatives, the farmers, and everyone involved in producing bread, even though they've done the dirty work, it's ultimately God who does it. So we see here with the bracha, it's the building block of Jewish liturgy, the movement from kavanah to keva, from prayer as something spontaneous that comes from the heart to a fixed liturgy that we say before specific occasions. Whenever we have a piece of food, it's not supposed to be a quotidian thing that we do every single day and not even think about it, but we're supposed to sanctify even the most everyday activity like having a piece of food and acknowledging God's role in producing that food.
And that goes back to what you first said, the conflict between the rote of just doing it and then consciously making it a honorable, from the heart, spiritual response.
Right. So we have a prescribed liturgy for when we're about to partake of food, and yet the liturgy is meant to create a sense of mindfulness within us and a sense of gratitude to God for the bounty that God has given us. And so we're meant to have within us that sense of kavanah.
So you're saying that we're meant to have conflict all our life.
Yes.
I mean, I read this Heschel article, which of course goes into all of what you were just talking about. And I read it, and I have a real personal issue there, right? I think that's a good word. I have a real personal issue there. I mean, I can't really resolve it in my own, you know, my own self.
The tension.
The tension,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Right, so we have this prayer book, which exists because over time, Jews became less skilled in the art of prayer, the art of avodah from the heart.
Less
But-
skilled, or
Less,
we really didn't know from this skill?
right, yeah.
I mean, if you look at it from what the two articles, it was the development